Lecture 2.1, the Greek verbal system. Now, this lecture corresponds to David Allen Black's Chapter 2, the Greek verb system, a bird's eye view. You'll notice this chapter is just attempting to broadly overview the Greek verbal system without asking you to memorize anything, which is really pedagogically a very good idea. So you need to read the chapter carefully, and in this short lecture I will touch on a few of the things that I think are the most important for you to pick up in the chapter, but please do read the entire chapter carefully. In this chapter, we begin thinking a little more grammatically using terms like singular and plural, first person, second person, third person. Of course, first person is just the I, we form of the verb. The second person is the you plural form of the verb. Or in English, we have various regional plural forms, y'all or you guys, right? That's the second person plural. And the third person singular, he, she, or it, and the plural, they. So we're going to try to be precise in our terminology. We don't want to just say the you, y'all form or the he, they form. We want to be precise. One reason we want to be precise is so we can communicate clearly with each other and understand the best resources that are out there. Now, when you look at this word here in front of you, the word, the verb to have conjugated, it's I have, you have, he has. Notice that's spelled slightly differently. We have, you have, they have. There's really only one spelling change in the conjugation of this verb as we conjugate it. Contrast this with the Greek verb for I have. Echo, ekes, eke, ekamen, eketa, ekusi. You look at that, you say every single one of those endings is different. And you scratch your head and you say, is it just that the Greeks wanted to be difficult? Why did they do this? But it actually is a very it's a very efficient use of language. What we have here is we have the verb form is inflected. It changes spelling to communicate who is doing it. In other words, you notice the comparison next to it. The English, we must include the subject information, I, you, he, we, y'all, they. But in the Greek, that subject information is included in the ending itself. So we frequently do not have to include a pronoun of any type, but the verb itself communicates that. So if I come along and I read the verb echo, because of that ending right there, because of that ending O, I know this has a first-person singular subject. It's I have, or I am having. Sort of like as if we could squeeze the word. Here's a vice grips. Squeeze it, pop. Out would pop the word I, or the Greek word ego. That is included in that specific spelling that we give to the verb. Okay, so just understanding that concept, why we're learning these different endings. Also, in this chapter, you get introduced to some terminology. You get introduced to the term tense, voice, and mood. And when you have a verb and you're giving information about it, you will often give its tense, its voice, and its mood. And so what are these things? Well, in Greek, when we talk about tense, we're not just talking about time. To illustrate this visually, let me write very tiny. Time. Like a little mouse saying it. Time. But there's that. But more significant than time is something called, in Greek tense, is something called verbal aspect. And this terminology is going to be foreign to most of you. One way of thinking about it is the speaker's perspective on the action. What perspective is he choosing to give you on the action? And there are three main perspectives. There's a progressive perspective, and then there is a holistic perspective, which just looks at the action as a whole, and then there is a stative perspective, which speaks of the action completed, and then a state that results from that action. So whether it's some progressive depiction of it as repeated, habitual, ongoing, or it's just painting it as happening before us, or whether it just views it as a whole, just speaks of it without any further comment, or whether it looks at a state that results from it. Now, this terminology is a little bit different from what David Alan Black uses, and in fact, his terminology on verbal aspect is kind of non-standard. The standard terminology, which is different from his, the progressive perspective, is called imperfective aspect. The holistic perspective is called perfective aspect, which he calls it, I believe, I'm going to glance here and see, he calls it aoristic aspect, which is not standard terminology. So he does use the term imperfective, but then he uses the term perfective to describe the stative, which, again, I'm giving you the more standard terminology for verbal aspect. I realize it differs from the book here, but you need to follow me on this. So verbal aspect, we have imperfective, which is progressive. You have perfective, which is that holistic look, and that's what your textbook calls aoristic. And then you have the stative perspective, or the stative aspect, and there's that's, again, the standard terminology is to call it, in fact, stative. Unfortunately, your textbook calls that perfective. I really like your textbook, but in this case, he's not following standard terminology. It's a little confusing. So we're gonna use standard terminology, and we're also going to use these kind of helpful pedagogical summary there about the speaker's perspective. The voice is who is doing the action. Is it active? The subject doing the action, like I hit. Is it passive? The subject receiving the action. I am being hit, right, by someone else, right? I, the subject, am passive. Or is it something called the middle voice? And the middle voice is English speakers understand it most easily as reflexive, like I hit myself. But actually, that use is very uncommon. That reflexive idea is very uncommon for the middle. It's just in Greek, there were certain verbs that they marked with the specific ending because they wanted to emphasize the subject's participation in the action. Verbs that had to deal with reciprocity, where there's giving or taking, or mental conception, or movement from one place to the other, or getting clothed, or getting washed, washing and clothing. There's just this group of activities that in the Greek thinker's mind needed to be marked with a specific ending that visually and I guess both visually written and also euphonically, sound-wise, sounding, it marked the verb as having the subject involved in a specific way in the action. And it's a little bit different from our language. And there aren't a lot of grammars gloss over this idea, so we're going to try to understand it a bit more deeply. Then there's the mood. The mood is just the speaker's attitude towards the action. Is it presented as factual? Is it a fact, or is it presented as a command, like an imperative, or is it presented as somehow contingent, or as a wish? So there's different ways of marking the verb too, as to if the speaker views the action as potential or as actual. And again, we're just getting a bird's eye view in this chapter. We're not trying to understand everything. We're just trying to broadly understand the concepts before we dive into the specifics. In the chapter, there's a nice chart here of the tenses in Greek, and in reality, the first 5 tenses listed are far and away of the most common. Most beginning grammars only cover these 5 tenses: the present, the future, the imperfect, the aorist, and the perfect. The pluperfect is very rare, and the future perfect, I believe, is even more rare. So if you can focus on those 5 tenses, you'll be in good shape. We can do a small visual of those. Remember, when it comes to Greek tense, time is the little mouse, right? Time is what's less important, but we will organize it according to time for English speakers here. So we have the past, the present, and the future. realizing again that time is really a secondary element in the Greek verbal system. And the main thing is the speaker's perspective, right? The progressive, holistic, or stative. So for the present tense is our default understanding of that is a progressive presentation of the action. The future tense, our default understanding of that is just holistically describing the action. The imperfect tense, our default understanding of that is a progressive presentation in the past. The aorist views the action as a whole, a holistic view of the action in the past, and the perfect views the action as completed with an emphasis on the ongoing state, the existing state that has, it's not that the action continues, but the state that results from the completed action. And so, for example, I have walked to school today. So now I'm here. So the state that results from that is me being here. And so that's our 5 main tenses: the present, the future, the imperfect, the aorist, and the perfect. And we'll focus on more details on those as we go along. I cannot exhort you enough to read the chapter carefully, think about what he says, and enjoy being able to soak some of these concepts in before we dive into the particulars. This is the end of video lecture 2.1, the Greek verbal system.